Hey, good morning, guys. Aaron Kubitz with Functional Aesthetics of Eau Claire. So today I wanted to talk about today's concept of functional movement. So I've been going through the past couple of weeks and talking about different pillars of the training philosophy at my gym and the way that I tend to approach training. So the past couple of weeks, I started out with number one, the importance of mindset, and kind of that principle that of paradigms, right? The see, do, get concept that what you see or the way that you see the world, the way that you view the world, kind of determines what sort of actions you take, and the actions that you take tend to at least, I mean, not every action is going to turn out exactly like you wanted it to, but at least it points you in a general direction. So we can generally say that the actions you take tend to determine the outcomes that you get. So it's very important to make sure that your mindset is right first going into any sort of activity to set yourself up for the best possible chance of success. After that, I talked about the importance of structural integrity or having balance between all the different muscles that act on opposite sides of a joint. So, for example, your chest, your anterior deltoids in the front of the shoulder, as opposed to your upper back, your rear deltoids, and some of your rotator cuff muscles, right? Making sure that there's some balance in your hips as well. Your hip flexors aren't too tight while your butt is weak or your lower back is weak, things like that, right? And then after that, I talked about, and I think this was last week, I talked about the importance of mobility and how mobility isn't just being flexible. Mobility has to do with um, strength throughout the entire range of motion. So, for example, martial arts, where you are able to not only get into that range of motion with your kick, but also hold it there and stay in that position for a while. Being able to do things like the Olympic lift, or like you're doing an overhead squat, you have to have great mobility in your upper back, but just not the range of motion, also the strength to be able to hold that weight up over your head. Obviously, you have to have the mobility and stability in the shoulder joints. And then probably the most significant area here is down in the hips, your ankles, and your knees. You got to have that flexibility, the range of motion to get down to that position. But that's not just that flexibility to do that, but also to be able to do that under load. So that's the difference between mobility and flexibility. If you want to get more detailed analysis of any of those topics, you can go back and check out those posts that I wrote and I put out there. But today I want to talk about the concept of functional movement. And maybe 10 years ago, there was kind of like this big like functional movement craze came about, right? And a lot of guys in the powerlifting and bodybuilding circles would kind of poo-poo that as like, it's not functional if you're not standing on a Bosu ball doing like an overhead squat with, while doing a biceps curl or something, right? And I do tend to agree with that notion, right? Just because something is difficult, just because something is hard, doesn't necessarily mean that it is effective training. And just because something is not directly, does not directly mimic the movement that you're doing in everyday life, this also does not mean that it is not functional. So in today's brief little video, I hope to address some of the common narratives around functional movement, and then give you my belief around and what constitutes functional movement. So you got perhaps one of the biggest proponents of functional movement, and it can be seen in the name of his business, would be Naudi Aguilar. So he has a business called Functional Patterns. You've probably seen it if you've been in the fitness space for any length of time. Very highly promoted. I'm not sure, but I think he's down and based out of Arizona, perhaps. I was actually a couple of years ago. I hiked the Grand Canyon rim to rim, so I had to take a shuttle drive to the other side. It was a pretty long drive, and I got to talk to the shuttle driver for quite a long time, and he was saying that he had actually seen a lot of good results working with functional pattern specialists down in Sedona, or not Sedona, Scottsdale, Arizona, because he had actually severely screwed up his back playing football. Actually, not from being hit, but just from stepping down improperly on the ground, ankle rolled, and then it all the way up the kinetic chain into his back. And so it just kind of goes to show that, you know, all what's happening at one part of the body is going to affect all the other different parts of the body as well, right? It's just going to kind of go from one thing to the next. So, for example, you can even get TMJ in your jaw if your ankles, if you have flat feet, or if your ankles are out of alignment, right? Because if your ankles are not properly aligned, it's going to throw your knees off, it's going to throw your hips off, which ultimately goes all the way up into your neck and your head and your jaw and all that kind of stuff. So, and that was very clearly seen by that. But anyway, Naudi Aguilar his philosophy tends to be based off of fascial lines, right? And if you're not familiar with fascia, next time you're cooking a chicken or something like that, or if you're a hunter and you're skinning out a deer, that thin, almost transparent membrane that's on the underside of the skin that connects the skin to the muscle, that is your fascia, right? And we didn't really tend to think about that too much, early on, but let's say perhaps since the early 2000s, it started getting a lot more attention, especially in physical therapy circles and stuff like that. And what you can see is that your fascia is actually organized in spiral lines around the body, right? And so if you can picture a mummy, right, and how he's kind of wrapped in this bundling, but unlike just being wrapped in concentric circles all the way around horizontal to the ground like that, the fascia tends to follow particular patterns across the body. So and this is why they call it the slings of the body, right? So you'll have, for example, I can stand up here a little bit, from my shoulder, from my left arm down to my right leg is a fascial line as well, and obviously on the other side too. And so your body likes to work in kinetic chains, not in isolation. And so this is where it comes to when you're talking about things like bodybuilding, right? Yes, you can build muscle, and you can build muscle quite efficiently using machines. In fact, using the hack squat or the hip sled machine at the gym tends to be a more probably one of the best ways to hypertrophy or build up the muscle in your quadriceps, even better than doing a back squat. But just because you can build a lot of muscle, does that mean that that's the best way to do it? Because like a lot of guys, when they get older, right, they start thinking, okay, I'm going to be starting to lose muscle mass as I get older. I also, don't want to get myself injured. And so many times they will go and start using machines, right? Or use resistance band type stuff. And they will shy away from the standard, traditional, old school styles of training, unless of course they have a solid background in that. But many beginners, if you're brand new to the gym when you're getting into this, they will shy away from those things, and they just stick to a lot of isolation movements, thinking that that is going to help them to improve their longevity because they built more muscle, and it's going to help, and it's going to be safer than doing these traditional old school compound movements, body weight exercises, gymnastic type stuff. When in actuality, while building some muscle can help with like metabolic health, in terms of longevity, doing free weight exercises, training like an athlete, and training in different planes of movement too, right? Not just training straight up and down. Like, cause even like a back squat, I don't tend to agree with Naudi Aguilar that back squats and stuff are not functional, right? But I do think that if that's all that you do, you will tend to become a little bit brittle, right? You will not have that real world kind of strength, the kind of strength you need on the athletic field. Because what happens when you're running is that you're very often on one leg at a time. In fact, you're always on one leg at a time when you're running, right? And so you need to be able to have strength and coordination to be able to generate force in that more dynamic environment of on the playing field. This is not to say that doing the squat and doing the deadlift and the bench press are not functional. I don't agree with Naudi Aguilar from that standpoint, but they are. But if done to exclusion of other movements, as I'll get into a little bit later on in this video, they are actually non-functional. It can set you up for injuries later on down the line. Now, is it better than just exclusively training with machines? Yes, for sure. Because training with the machines, about the only benefit you're going to get from that in terms of a longevity standpoint is by increasing the size of the muscle, you create a larger storage depot for glycogen, which is the storage form of carbohydrates, which means that you if you have a greater sink for the carbohydrates to go into, that means that blood sugar is going to be drawn down in the bloodstream. And there is a direct relationship between the levels of blood sugar. So if your blood sugar is chronically elevated, you're going to be having, in the long term, a lot of chronic health conditions arise from having chronically, it's actually toxic to your body to have too much sugar floating around. And so if you have bigger muscles, even if you're not doing a ton of aerobic exercise or a bunch of cardio, it can tend to help keep you more metabolically healthy by having those bigger muscles. And then obviously the joint strength or the bone strength, right? You can have increased bone density from lifting heavy things. The downside is that training strictly with machines is that it tends to eliminate the role of stabilizer muscles such as your rotator cuff, and that's why I talked about in some of my previous posts that as long as your prime mover muscles like your chest, your upper back, your lats, your biceps, triceps, and all this kind of stuff are balanced with each other and you are performing a balanced strength training routine, there really isn't very much need, at least on a regular basis, to do direct work for the rotator cuff because it's already working really hard when you're doing a bench press, when you're doing an overhead press, when you're doing pull-ups, push-ups, all these different kinds of things, handstands, right? And so it's already getting the exercise that it needs by virtue of doing those things. And so it's a little bit redundant to add that in. Now, as I had said in some of those shoulder health things, is that when you are coming back from a shoulder injury, that means that those muscles probably haven't been used for a very long time. And so you need to get them back into shape. And so doing some isolation work to directly train the rotator cuff to help build that endurance back into there while you are starting to train and do that other stuff can be beneficial, right? So that's the one downside of the machines. They're not going to be training those stabilizer muscles like the rotator cuff, stabilizer muscles like the ones in your hips, in your butt, your adductors when you're doing a squat, all these different things, right? So I kind of, I said I was going to kind of give my opinion a little bit later on. I already gave some of my opinion. So let's kind of go back to the original topic here because I got a little bit sidetracked. What I want to look at is how, you have Naudi Aguilar, and I very much in depth talked about his training philosophy that like essentially you need to be training a lot of unilateral type stuff, training movement patterns, not muscle groups or muscle individual muscles or even muscle groups, which is the kind of like the bodybuilding mentality. And I tend to agree with that, right? And then you have like the powerlifters, right? And they will be like, yeah, you know, they're not really that concerned with perhaps athletic performance. In fact, the reason that powerlifting was started was because of guys who still wanted to have a sport to participate in, um, even though weren't necessarily they weren't athletic enough per se to play like let's say football or some other things. It's not to say that some football players are powerlifters and some powerlifters have been football players, right? But that is actually the way that the powerlifting sport was designed. It was a sport of strength where you didn't need to have all the other aspects of athleticism as well. And so powerlifters would be like, kind of poo-pooing Naudi Aguilar's, ideas many times. And so what I want to kind of address in this video is, who's right? And so I find that maybe the best way to start that conversation off with is to just look at what is the dictionary definition of functional, right? And so the first definition I came across, I'm going to read this off here, is of or having a special activity, purpose, or task relating to the way in which something works or operates. And so according to this definition, powerlifting, would be functional, right? It's functional for its intended purpose, right? To make you as strong as possible in the squat, bench press, and the deadlift, right? Bodybuilding is functional because it, even using the machines, right, to create that, because your goal is to build the most aesthetic, most conditioned physique. You want to have the best combination of muscular size, muscular balance, and then leanness as well to have that perfect package. And so, from that standpoint, it is functional, right? And then Naudi Aguilar's thing, it's definitely functional too because he's trying to train you for sports, trying to train you for real life, and so it does very well for that designated purpose. Um, but then if we look at the other definition that I came across for functional, which is designed to be practical and useful rather than attractive. Okay, so according to this definition, we can automatically rule out bodybuilding. Bodybuilding does not, in and of itself, make you non-functional, right? But if you're only using machines or primarily relying on machines because all you care about is building some muscle. So, for example, a couple of years ago, I was listening to a video by a popular YouTuber, Dr. Mike Israetel, right? And he was talking about how doing overhead presses is a waste of time for bodybuilders because it's not the best way to build to hypertrophy the shoulder muscles, right? And I was like, okay, well, if all you care about is building bigger deltoids and bigger muscles, and you don't care about how that bigger muscle or that strength transfers over into the real world, then sure. But doing a seated press like he was advocating for, instead of doing a standing press, which is much more athletic, because you think about how often are you going to be in a real life scenario uh, sitting on the ground while you're pressing something over your head. There might be some scenarios where you're doing that, and that's why I do think doing something like a Z press, where you're sitting on the ground kind of in a side splits position and you're overhead pressing in a rack, can be useful to ensure that you are lifting with a proper technique and you're not arching your back too much, and it helps to build up the strength in your lower traps, helps to ensure a good bar path when you're doing this. And so that can be a good accessory exercise. But I think ultimately having that squat, bench press, deadlift, overhead press can be a more functional way to approach your training so that you're going to be more functional for life, and it's going to have a better transfer over to sports as well. Um, Now, the other problem is with training in like a bodybuilding fashion where you're just concerned with the aesthetic of how everything looks, right? And the only reason the way that you think about your core is in your six pack, right? And what that looks like. But in actuality, the core is everything from the top of your pelvis all the way around 360 up to the base of your neck, so up into the shoulder girdle and stuff like that too, right? That's all your core, and that serves as the base of support from which your arms and your legs can produce movement. And going back to Naudi Aguilar's thing, having you need to also have coordination between the strength of the lower body musculature and then the upper body musculature, and then that transfer coupling, which is your core, to transfer that movement through the core, right? So, yeah, transferring that movement through your core, right? Because like if you're using, like, let's say for example a hip sled, you're doing the hack squat machine or whatever, the gym, and you're just pushing that thing up and down. Yeah, it's training your legs great, but it's not training your legs to work in conjunction with your arms. It's not even training your legs to work in conjunction with your core, which is exactly what it would be doing in a real life scenario. So now you build up these big strong legs, and it's like with a old school therapists and strength coaches would talk about firing a cannon off of a canoe, right? So the cannon is those big, strong quadricep muscles, your big, strong chest muscles or whatever, right? And then it doesn't have the core, and the canoe is your core, right? Instead of having a battleship, because you've developed your strength by training the lower body and the core and the upper body synergistically, as Naudi Aguilar advocates for, or even as doing a free weight back squat, and even like a lot of Olympic lifting does, right? Because you're having to stabilize your spine. That's actually the primary function of the core is to help protect the spine during dynamic movement, right? And so you have this outer unit, which is, your lats, your rector spinae muscles, your six pack. And then you have the inner unit, which is involved in your pelvic floor muscles, your transverse abdominals, your internal and external obliques. And if you're not doing things to train those in a real life scenario, and you're only doing, let's say, for example, you're doing some ab crunches or something like that, then when it comes time to, comes time or go time in a real life, scenario, that strength isn't gonna be applicable to that, and in fact could actually be a detriment because it's going to increase the risk of injury because that core section isn't as strong as the legs to be able to handle that, and you potentially snap something while you're trying to, pull out, a tree root or lift a big heavy log or a rock or something like that, or pull yourself up over a wall, different things like that. um, let's see what else I had written here too. Um, yeah, so I think I kind of covered that. So most of the prevailing ideas around functional movement. So my philosophy when it comes to functional movement is to do it all, right? I don't believe that doing, for example, preacher curls or tricep press downs is a non-functional movement, but if that's all you do for your biceps and your triceps training, yes, it's going to be non-functional, right? Because my definition of functional is how does it transfer to your everyday life, right? How does it transfer to sports? If you play rugby, if you play soccer, if you play football, if you're playing basketball and stuff, um, how does that transfer over to the sport that you're playing, right? And so obviously, then the next idea that comes to mind here, and the next question, it would be, okay, well, then wouldn't functional be contextual? Yes, functional is contextual, but I think that at a bare minimum, we need to be training all the different movement planes of the body, right? And training the primal movement patterns, right? So every solid workout routine should include the following 6 movements, and maybe 7 if you include gait, which include walking and running. So you want to include your squatting, right? Obviously, that's something you're going to be doing with a back squat, and so that's fine, right? You also want to be doing lunging, though, right? So lunging in all different directions, too, not just front and back, but also sideways. So doing things like Cossack squats, right? Drop lunges, where you're, or also known as a curtsy squat, right? Where you're stepping down behind yourself. It's actually a great way to not only stretch your butt, but also to strengthen your butt muscles. So for runners who tend to get knee injuries easily, this can be a great way to help work that as well. Um, the other thing that uh, so the next movement that you want to be training as well is pushing, right? But not just in one direction. You want to be pushing overhead. You want to be pushing horizontally as well. And then the same thing goes for the pulling. And as I talked about in my Bulletproof Shoulders ebook that I created, and if you're interested in getting that, just drop Bulletproof down in the comments below, and I'll shoot that ebook over to you. But anyway, what I talked about in there is how your horizontal pulling, so like barbell rows, reverse flies, face pulls, that kind of stuff, should be 3 times as much as vertical pulling. So like doing pull-ups, lat pull downs, and pulling in that plane of movement, right, to keep the shoulders healthy. And so you have your pushing, you have your pulling, and then you also have the rotational movement, right? So, or you also have your hinge pattern, which would be different from the squat because you're tipping forward at the hips first before the knees break. Whereas when you're doing a squat, your hips and your knees should break pretty much at the same time. Whereas when you're doing a hinge, it's a little bit different. So when you're doing kettlebell squats, when you're doing deadlifts, that's going to be your hinge movement. And then the last part, and this is really where what differentiates uh, the part that bodybuilders and powerlifters could add into their training to make them more functional, according to my standard, would be rotational movement. And I don't just mean doing, maybe some Russian twists or some twisting leg raises or something like that. We're talking about, doing, cable wood chops, doing some cable chops or something, you can use dumbbells, you can use a plate to do that, doing corkscrew exercises. Because when you're doing it that way, you're not only training your abs, you're training your core, but you're training it in a functional way that you would probably maybe even use in real life when you're trying to pull something from the ground here and lift it to something over your head, dragging something across the yard or whatever. And that's really the way that you can train your abs. Like I used to do when I was in high school, several hundred sit-ups and push-ups every night, right? And now, as a guy in my 40s, I've got better abs than I had in high school, and I rarely ever do any direct work for my abs because of training the abs in more of a functional way, and then also diet, right? You got to have the right diet to be able to reveal that. I mean, think about it. You're training your obliques even when you're walking or running or sprinting, right? Obviously, the intensity is so low that you're not going to really build very much. You're not going to build any muscle just by going for walks unless you haven't been walking, you've been an invalid for a while. But you are training your obliques, you're training your abs. Remember those fascial lines I was talking about? So that is the biggest thing I would talk about for like the bodybuilders and stuff is to incorporate some rotational movements that incorporate both the lower body and the upper body all in one movement. So not just something for the lower body and then something for the upper body and then something for the core, but train them all together synergistically as nature intended. All right, guys, that's all I have to say about functional movement today. If you got any questions about that, if you have anything to add to what I talked about today, go ahead and leave that in the comments below. And until then, I will see you tomorrow when I'll be talking a little bit more about the health of your shoulders.